Thomas stepped out of his car and braved in the fresh mountain air. After 5 long years away chasing his career in the city, the peaceful quiet of his hometown felt strange yet welcoming. His uncle's luxury cabin stood before him, its wooden exterior gleaming in the afternoon sun. For the next week, this beautiful place, with its private lake access, hot tub, and traditional Finnish sauna, would be his home. As he unpacked his bags, his phone buzzed. It was Mark, his childhood best friend. "You're finally back. Mom's making her famous pot roast tonight. Come over at 7, no excuses." Thomas smiled. Mark had always been like a brother to him, even when life had pulled them in different directions. A home-cooked meal sounded perfect after the long drive. Later that evening, Thomas pulled up to the familiar 2-story house where he'd spent countless afternoons during his teenage years. He grabbed the bottle of wine he brought and walked to the door. Before he could knock, Mark swung it open. "Look what the cat dragged in." Mark pulled him into a bear hug. Still the same skinny guy, just with fancier clothes now. Thomas laughed as they stepped inside. The house smelled amazing, spices, roasted meat, and something sweet baking in the oven. It felt like stepping back in time. "Mom, Thomas is here," Mark called out. Thomas expected to see the same woman he remembered, kind eyes, graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the comfortable clothes of a busy single mom. He was completely unprepared for the woman who walked out of the kitchen. Lisa wiped her hands on a dish towel and smiled. "Thomas, it's been too long." Thomas froze. Mark's mother had changed. Her formerly gray-streaked hair was now a rich auburn, styled in soft waves that framed her face. She'd lost weight, but in a way that accentuated her natural curves. She wore slim jeans and a simple blouse that hinted at her figure without being obvious about it. But it was more than just physical changes. She carried herself with a new confidence that was impossible to ignore. "Mrs. Davis, you look amazing," Thomas managed, suddenly aware he was staring. She laughed, and the sound made something stir in him. "Please, it's just Lisa now." Mrs. Davis went away with the divorce papers. Right. Mark had mentioned his parents finalizing their divorce 2 years ago. "Well, Lisa, it's really good to see you again." Thomas handed her the wine, their fingers brushing briefly. An unexpected jolt of electricity made him pull back too quickly. Dinner was a lively affair, with Mark dominating the conversation with stories and questions about city life. Thomas tried to focus on his friend, but his eyes kept drifting to Lisa. She was different. More relaxed, more present. She laughed freely and occasionally touched her neck when she spoke, drawing his attention to the soft skin there. "So Thomas, Mark tells me you're staying at Robert's cabin," Lisa said during a lull in conversation. "That place is gorgeous. I've always loved the craftsmanship." "You should see the sauna he installed last year," Thomas replied. "Imported directly from Finland, according to my uncle." "I've never been in a proper sauna," she said, her eyes showing genuine interest. Mark jumped in. "Mom's been on this self-improvement kick since the divorce. New haircut, yoga classes, even took a pottery workshop last month." Lisa shot her son a look that was part embarrassment, part warning. "It's called living, Mark." For a brief moment, Thomas caught Lisa's gaze. There was something there, a flicker of something private and meaningful, before she looked away and began clearing the dishes. As Thomas drove back to the cabin that night, he couldn't stop thinking about that look. For the first time, he had seen Mark's mother not as his friend's parent, but as a woman, attractive, intriguing, and somehow mysterious. The realization both unsettled and excited him. 2 days passed with Thomas settling into the cabin routine. He spent mornings hiking nearby trails and afternoons catching up on work emails. The thought of Lisa kept returning at unexpected moments, while brewing coffee during his shower as he sat watching the sunset from the deck. He drove to the local market for supplies, his shopping list simple: bread, cheese, some fruit, and maybe a decent cut of meat to grill. As he examined peaches for ripeness, a familiar voice caught him off guard. "You have to feel for the slight give, not too soft but not too firm." Thomas turned to find Lisa standing beside him, a basket over her arm filled with fresh vegetables and a bottle of wine. She wore a sundress that revealed tanned shoulders and the light dusting of freckles across her collarbone. "I was never good at picking fruit," Thomas admitted, suddenly aware of how close she stood. Her perfume, something light and floral, mixed with the sweet scent of the peaches. Lisa smiled and reached past him, her arm brushing his as she selected a peach. "This one's perfect." She placed it in his hand, her fingers lingering against his palm. "How are you enjoying Robert's cabin? It's exactly what I needed. The city never really gets quiet, you know?" They moved through the market together, conversation flowing easily between them. Lisa told him about her life since the divorce, rediscovering old hobbies, making the house truly hers after 20 years of marriage. "Mark probably told you his father left for a younger woman," she said as they reached the wine section. "Classic midlife crisis. I was devastated at first, but now," she selected a bottle, studying the label. "Now I feel more myself than I have in years." Thomas watched her, noticing how her eyes crinkled slightly when she smiled, how she tucked her hair behind her ear when thinking. She was beautiful in a way that made his mouth dry. "The sauna at the cabin is amazing," he said suddenly. "You mentioned you've never been in one." Lisa looked up, surprised by the change in topic. "That's right. You should try it sometime. It's very relaxing." The words hung between them, loaded with unintended meaning. Lisa studied him, her expression unreadable. "Are you inviting me to use your sauna, Thomas?" Heat crept up his neck. "I mean, if you wanted to. It's really therapeutic. My uncle says it's good for everything from muscle tension to clearing your mind." He was rambling now, trying to make the invitation sound casual rather than what it might appear to be. "Are you free tomorrow evening?" Lisa asked, her directness catching him off guard. "Yes," he answered too quickly. "Then I accept your invitation." She smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. "Should I bring anything?" "Just a bathing suit and maybe a bottle of wine," Thomas said, immediately imagining her in a swimsuit and feeling guilty for it. This was Mark's mother, his friend's mother. What was he thinking? "I'll be there around 7 then." She touched his arm lightly. "It'll be nice to catch up properly, without Mark talking over everyone." They finished shopping and walked to the parking lot together. As they reached Lisa's car, she turned to him. "You know, I always wondered what happened to that shy teenager who used to raid our fridge after school. You've grown up well, Thomas." Before he could respond, she leaned in and kissed his cheek, her lips soft against his skin. "See you tomorrow." Thomas stood in the parking lot long after Lisa's car disappeared down the road. His cheek tingled where she'd kissed him, and a mixture of excitement and dread churned in his stomach. He was playing with fire, and he knew it. But as he loaded his groceries into his car, one thought kept repeating in his mind. He couldn't wait for tomorrow night. Driving back to the cabin, Thomas rehearsed what he would say to Mark if he ever found out. Was it really so wrong? They were both adults. Lisa was single now, but the nagging voice of conscience reminded him of years of friendship, of Mark's trust. Still, as the road wound through the trees toward the cabin, Thomas found himself planning tomorrow evening. What music to play, which wine to chill, how hot to make the sauna. Whatever happened, he knew tomorrow would change things between him and Lisa forever. Thomas spent all day cleaning the cabin. He dusted surfaces that didn't need dusting, vacuumed twice, and rearranged the living room furniture before moving it back to its original position. His nerves made him restless. What was he doing, inviting his friend's mother over? And not just for dinner, but for a sauna, something so intimate by nature. He prepared a tray of snacks, cheese, crackers, sliced fruit, and put 2 bottles of wine in the refrigerator, one red and one white, unsure of Lisa's preference. At 6 he lit the sauna to warm it up and jumped in the shower. Standing before the mirror after his shower, towel wrapped around his waist, Thomas studied his reflection. At 28 he was in decent shape, though not as fit as he'd been in college. Did Lisa find him attractive? The thought made his stomach flip with a mixture of guilt and excitement. He dressed casually in jeans and a blue button-down shirt that an ex-girlfriend had once said brought out his eyes. Just as he finished combing his hair, the doorbell rang. His heart jumped to his throat. Lisa stood on the doorstep holding a bottle of wine and a small bag. She wore white linen pants and a loose top that draped elegantly over her curves. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, revealing the delicate line of her neck. "Right on time," Thomas said, stepping back to let her in. "You look nice." "So do you." Lisa entered, her eyes taking in the cabin. "This place is even more beautiful than I remembered." Thomas gave her a tour, watching her face as she admired the vaulted ceilings and the wall of windows overlooking the lake. The evening sun cast everything in golden light, making Lisa's skin glow. They settled on the deck with wine and the snack tray. Conversation came easily, far more easily than Thomas had expected. Lisa told him about her job as an interior designer, how she'd started her own business after the divorce. "Mark thinks I'm having some kind of midlife crisis," she said, laughing, "but I feel like I'm finally living my life for me, not as someone's wife or just as someone's mother." Thomas listened, fascinated by this woman who seemed so different from the mother he remembered from his youth. She was vibrant, passionate about her work, curious about the world. "You seem different," he said, refilling her glass. "Not in a bad way, just more alive somehow." Lisa's eyes met his. "Divorce is a strange thing. Painful, yes, but also freeing. I spent 20 years being Mrs. Davis, making sure everyone else was happy. Now I'm just Lisa." "I like just Lisa," Thomas said softly. Something shifted in the air between them. Lisa set down her wine glass and looked toward the trees. "So about this famous sauna I've been hearing about." Thomas led her to the sauna house, a cedar structure built behind the main cabin with a small changing area attached. The heat hit them as he opened the door, the scent of cedar intensifying in the warm air. "I'll let you change," he said, handing her a towel. "There are hooks for your clothes in there. I'll change out here and knock before coming in." Alone in the main cabin, Thomas changed into his swim shorts, his hands trembling slightly. This wasn't just his friend's mother anymore. This was a woman he was undeniably attracted to, a woman who seemed to return that interest. He knocked on the sauna door. "Ready?" "Come in," Lisa called. She sat on the lower bench, a white towel wrapped around her. Her bare shoulders gleamed in the dim light, a thin sheen of perspiration already forming on her skin. Thomas swallowed hard and took a seat on the bench opposite her, suddenly very aware of the small space they shared. "It's hotter than I expected," Lisa said, her voice hushed in the warm stillness. "You get used to it," Thomas replied, trying to keep his eyes from lingering on the way her collarbone caught shadows, the elegant curve of her neck, the few strands of hair that had escaped her ponytail and now clung damply to her skin. Lisa smiled at him across the heated space, her eyes reflecting the soft glow of the sauna lights. "I'm glad I accepted your invitation, Thomas." The words hung in the steamy air between them, heavy with possibility. The heat of the sauna wrapped around them like a blanket, creating a world separate from reality. Thomas poured water over the hot stones, and steam hissed upward, filling the small wooden room. Droplets of sweat formed on Lisa's skin, tracing slow paths down her neck and across her shoulders. "In Finland, they say the sauna is where you leave your troubles behind," Thomas said, breaking the charged silence. "Something about the heat washing everything away." Lisa leaned back against the cedar wall, her eyes half closed. "I could use some of that. The last few years haven't been easy. Do you want to talk about it?" Thomas asked, surprised at his own boldness. She opened her eyes fully, studying him. "It's strange. I hardly know you as an adult, Thomas, yet I feel like I can tell you things I can't tell anyone else." "Maybe because I'm not really part of your everyday life," he suggested. "Sometimes strangers make the best confidants." "You're hardly a stranger," Lisa said with a small smile. "I've known you since you were 14 with braces and that terrible haircut." Thomas groaned, covering his face. "Please don't remind me of that haircut." Their laughter eased the tension, and Lisa shifted to sit more comfortably, adjusting her towel. "The truth it is," she began, "Jack, Mark's father, had been cheating for years. I just didn't want to see it. When he finally left, it wasn't just for a younger woman. It was for the freedom he felt he'd lost by marrying so young." Thomas listened, watching the play of emotions across her face. "The funny thing is," Lisa continued, "once he was gone, I realized I felt the same way, like I could finally breathe again." She met Thomas's eyes. "Does that make me a terrible person?" "No," Thomas said without hesitation. "It makes you human." The steam swirled between them as they talked. Lisa told him about rebuilding her life, the challenges of dating in her 40s, the joy of rediscovering passions she'd set aside for family life. Thomas shared his own stories, career struggles, a broken engagement 2 years ago, his uncertainty about the future. Time seemed to suspend in the heated space. Thomas couldn't remember the last time he'd opened up to someone this way, without filters or pretense. "We should take a break," he said eventually, noticing Lisa's flushed cheeks. First-timers shouldn't stay in too long. Outside, the evening air felt shockingly cool against their heated skin. They sat on the wooden bench overlooking the lake, towels around their shoulders, the setting sun painting the water gold and crimson. "This is beautiful," Lisa said, her voice soft. She turned to him, their faces close in the fading light. "Thank you for sharing it with me." Thomas found himself unable to look away from her eyes, dark and inviting in the twilight. "I have a confession," he said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "When I was 16, I had the biggest crush on you." Lisa's expression shifted from surprise to something warmer. "Did you really?" Thomas nodded, embarrassed but unable to stop now. "Mark never knew. I'd make excuses to be at your house even when you wasn't home, hoping to talk to you. It was ridiculous." "It wasn't ridiculous," Lisa said gently. Her hand found his on the bench between them, her fingers cool against his palm. "It was sweet." "And now?" Thomas asked, his heart pounding. Lisa's fingers intertwined with his. "Now it's complicated." Thomas looked down at their joined hands. "Because of Mark." "Yes," she agreed. "But also because I find myself thinking about you in ways I shouldn't." Her admission hung in the air between them, honest and unguarded. Thomas moved his hand to her cheek, turning her face toward his. Lisa's breath caught, her lips parting slightly. The moment stretched between them, filled with possibility and danger. "We shouldn't," she whispered, but didn't pull away. "I know," Thomas replied, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. In the growing darkness, with the sounds of the forest around them and the lake shimmering before them, Thomas leaned forward. Lisa met him halfway, their lips coming together in a kiss that started gentle but quickly deepened with years of unacknowledged desire. Her hand slid to the back of his neck, drawing him closer as the last light faded from the sky. Morning light filtered through the cabin windows, casting warm patterns across the rumpled sheets. Thomas woke slowly, memories of the previous night washing over him. After their kiss by the lake, they had returned to the cabin, sharing another bottle of wine and more kisses that grew increasingly passionate. Yet when the moment had arrived to take things further, Lisa had gently pulled away, saying she needed time to think. She'd left just before midnight, the taste of her lips still lingering on his. Thomas rolled over, staring at the ceiling. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from Mark asking if he wanted to go fishing that afternoon. Guilt twisted in his stomach. How could he face his friend after kissing his mother? After wanting more than just kisses? He typed a quick excuse about needing to catch up on work, hating the lie but seeing no alternative. The moment he sent it, another message came through. This one from Lisa. "Last night was unexpected. Can we talk? Dinner at the Lakeside Inn, 7 p.m. The Lakeside Inn was in the next town over, a place they wouldn't likely run into anyone they knew. Thomas typed back, "I'll be there," then tossed his phone aside and covered his face with his hands. The day passed in a fog of anticipation and worry. Thomas tried to distract himself with work emails, but his mind kept returning to Lisa, the softness of her skin, the way she'd sighed against his mouth, the feel of her fingers running through his hair. At 6:30 he drove to the restaurant, arriving early. The Lakeside Inn was romantic without being obvious about it. Dim lighting, well-spaced tables, views of the water through large windows. He requested a table in the corner and ordered a whiskey to steady his nerves. Lisa arrived precisely at 7, wearing a simple black dress that accentuated every curve. Heads turned as she crossed the room to his table. She looked confident, beautiful, and completely out of his league. "You look amazing," Thomas said as she sat down. "Thank you." Lisa smiled, but there was tension around her eyes. "I've been thinking about last night all day." "Me too." Thomas leaned forward. "Lisa, His phone rang, interrupting whatever he'd been about to confess. Mark's name flashed on the screen. Thomas silenced it, but the moment was broken. "That was Mark," he said, unable to hide his discomfort. Lisa nodded, understanding in her eyes. "That's exactly what we need to talk about." They ordered wine and food, talking around the subject until their appetizers arrived. Finally, Lisa reached across the table and took his hand. "Thomas, last night was wonderful, But Mark is my son, and you're his oldest friend. I know, Thomas said, his thumb stroking the back of her hand, but I can't stop thinking about you, not just since I came back to town, for years. Something softened in Lisa's expression. What do you mean? That crush I told you about, it never really went away. Even when I was engaged, sometimes I'd find myself wondering what you were doing, if you were happy. The confession felt both terrifying and freeing. Lisa was quiet for a long moment. Mark would be hurt. He might never forgive either of us. I know, Thomas repeated, his voice low. Is that why you stopped last night? Partly, she admitted. But also because whatever this is between us, it deserves more than one rushed night. I've had enough meaningless encounters since my divorce. I don't want that with you. The waiter arrived with their entrees, forcing them to separate their hands and compose themselves. As they ate, their conversation shifted to safer topics. Thomas's work in the city, Lisa's plans to expand her design business. But underneath ran a current of tension, of unresolved desire. After dinner, they walked along the lakefront, the evening air cool against their skin. In the privacy of the darkness, Lisa stopped and turned to him. I can't stop thinking about you either, she confessed. But we need to be sure. And we need to figure out how to tell Mark, if this becomes something real. Thomas stepped closer, emboldened by her words. And if it does become something real, then we face it together, Lisa said, her voice steady despite the vulnerability in her eyes. This time when they kissed, it wasn't the heated rush of new discovery, but something deeper. A promise, a decision, a beginning. They drove back separately, Lisa following Thomas's taillights through the winding roads. At the fork that would take her home, she flashed her lights once in farewell and turned away, leaving Thomas to return to the cabin alone with his thoughts and the growing certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. 3 days passed in a sweet haze of secret text messages and stolen moments. Thomas and Lisa met once for coffee in a cafe 2 towns over and once for a brief walk by the lake, careful to avoid places where they might be seen. Each time their goodbye kisses grew longer, their hands more eager to explore. But they kept their unspoken agreement. Nothing more until they figured out what to tell Mark. On the 4th morning, Thomas woke to insistent knocking at the cabin door. He pulled on jeans and a t-shirt, running a hand through his messy hair as he made his way to the entrance. Mark stood on the porch, a 6-pack of beer in one hand and fishing gear in the other. Surprise. I got the day off and thought we could finally get out on the lake. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. Mark, hey, I wasn't expecting you. That's what makes it a surprise, Mark said, pushing past him into the cabin. Man, you look terrible. Late night? Just working, Thomas lied, following his friend inside. His phone sat on the coffee table, and he casually moved to pick it up, remembering the intimate messages from Lisa that remained undeleted. Mark set the beer in the refrigerator and glanced around. Place looks good. You been enjoying the sauna? Uncle Robert won't shut up about that thing whenever I see him. Thomas's mouth went dry at the mention of the sauna. Yeah, it's great. Real therapeutic. We should fire it up later, Mark suggested, plopping down on the couch. But first, fishing. Come on, get dressed. The bass are practically jumping into the boats this week. Unable to think of a reasonable excuse, Thomas changed clothes and joined Mark in the small fishing boat tied to the cabin's dock. The morning was beautiful. The lake surfaced like glass, but Thomas could barely appreciate it. His thoughts kept returning to Lisa, to the impossible situation they'd created. You've been weird since you got back, Mark said abruptly, casting his line into the water. And you keep avoiding me. What's going on? Thomas focused on baiting his hook, buying time. Nothing, man, just figuring some stuff out. Like what? Mark persisted. You know you can talk to me, right? We've been friends forever. Guilt twisted like a knife in Thomas's stomach. The weight of his secret pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. Maybe it would be better to just confess everything now, here on the water where Mark couldn't immediately storm off. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Thomas ignored it, but Mark noticed. You gonna check that? Could be important. Thomas reluctantly pulled out his phone. A text from Lisa lit up the screen. Thinking about you. When can I see you again? He moved to put the phone away, but Mark was quicker, snatching it from his hand with a playful grin. Who's got you so jumpy? You hiding a girl from me? The color drained from Thomas's face as Mark's smile disappeared, his eyes fixed on the screen. The silence between them stretched, broken only by the gentle lapping of water against the boat. "Mom?" Mark finally said, his voice hollow. "You're texting my mom about seeing her again?" Thomas reached for words, but nothing came. Mark scrolled up through the messages, his expression darkening with each swipe. "What the hell is this?" Mark demanded, holding up the phone with its trail of increasingly intimate exchanges. "Are you sleeping with my mother?" "It's not like that," Thomas began, but Mark cut him off. "Then what is it like? Explain it to me, because from these messages it sure looks like you're having some kind of thing with her." Thomas took a deep breath. "We haven't slept together. But we have feelings for each other." Mark's face contorted with disgust and hurt. "Feelings? She's 20 years older than you. She's my mother." "I know who she is," Thomas said quietly. "It's complicated, Mark. It wasn't planned." "How long?" Mark demanded, his knuckles white around the phone. "Since I got back to town," Thomas admitted. "It just happened." Mark threw the phone at Thomas's chest. "Take me back to shore, now." The ride back to the dock was silent and tense. As soon as the boat bumped against the wooden planks, Mark jumped out, grabbing his gear. "Mark, please," Thomas called after him. "Can we talk about this?" Mark turned, his face a mask of betrayal. "Stay away from me, and stay away from my mother." As his oldest friend stormed away, Thomas sat heavily on the dock, the morning sun suddenly offering no warmth at all. Thomas spent the day in a fog of misery, alternating between calling Mark, who wouldn't answer, and composing messages to Lisa that he deleted without sending. By evening, he finally texted her with the truth. "Mark knows. He saw our messages. He's furious." Her reply came quickly. "I know. He was just here. It wasn't pretty." Sleep eluded Thomas that night. By morning, he had decided to cut his vacation short. There seemed no point in staying now, with his friendship in ruins and the complicated feelings for Lisa tainted by Mark's pain. He began packing, moving mechanically around the cabin, his mind replaying Mark's expression of betrayal. The sound of tires on gravel made him pause. Through the window, he saw Mark's truck pulling up. His heart raced as he went to the door, prepared for another confrontation, possibly even a physical one. But when Mark stepped out of the truck, his face showed exhaustion rather than anger. They stood facing each other on the porch, the morning silence heavy between them. "I've been driving around all night," Mark finally said, his voice rough. "Trying to make sense of this." Thomas waited, not daring to hope. "I'm still angry," Mark continued. "But you've been my best friend since we were kids. I owe you the chance to explain. Not that there's any explanation that's going to make this okay." Before Thomas could respond, another car appeared on the narrow road leading to the cabin. Lisa's car. Mark turned, his body tensing as his mother parked and walked toward them. "What are you doing here?" Mark demanded. Lisa straightened her shoulders. "The same as you, I imagine, trying to fix this mess." The three of them moved inside at Thomas's awkward invitation. No one sat. They stood in the living room like strangers at an uncomfortable party. "This isn't something that can be fixed," Mark said, breaking the silence. "My best friend and my mother? It's wrong." "Why?" Lisa asked quietly. "Because of the age difference, or because you can't see me as a woman with needs and desires of my own?" Mark winced. "Mom, please." "No, Mark, I've spent 23 years putting you first. After your father left, I rebuilt my life around making sure you were okay. I don't regret that choice, but I'm more than just your mother." Thomas watched Lisa, admiring her strength even as he worried about the growing tension. "I know that," Mark said, his voice softer. "But why Thomas? Of all the men in the world, why did it have to be him?" Thomas stepped forward. "It wasn't planned, Mark. I came back to town, saw Lisa at dinner that first night, and something just clicked. I tried to ignore it. We both did." Mark looked between them, his expression pained. "And what happens now? You two ride off into the sunset together. Where does that leave me?" "Still my son," Lisa said firmly. "Still Thomas's friend, if you can find it in yourself to accept this. We're not asking for your blessing, Mark, just your understanding." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotions. Mark walked to the window, staring out at the lake. Thomas and Lisa exchanged glances, neither knowing what else to say. I need time, Mark finally said, turning back to them. I can't promise I'll ever be okay with this, but, he paused, struggling. You're both adults. It's your lives. It wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't rejection either. Thomas felt a small spark of hope. Mark looked directly at Thomas. Just be good to her. She deserves that. I will, Thomas promised. Mark nodded once, then walked to the door. I'll be in touch, eventually. After he left, Lisa moved into Thomas's arms. They held each other in silence, the weight of the confrontation slowly lifting. That went better than I expected, Lisa finally said. He'll come around, Thomas replied, hoping it was true. He just needs time. They moved to the deck overlooking the lake, sitting side by side as the morning sun sparkled on the water. Thomas took Lisa's hand, intertwining their fingers. I was going to leave today, he admitted. Go back to the city. Lisa turned to him, concern in her eyes. And now? Now I think I'll stay. At least until we figure out what this is between us. He squeezed her hand gently. No more sneaking around, no more guilt. Just us seeing where this goes. Lisa leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat watching the light dance across the water. What had begun as a casual invitation into a sauna had changed everything. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but as Thomas pressed a kiss to Lisa's hair, he knew with certainty that some invitations, despite their complications, were worth accepting.